In the middle of the night, they raided our home because my uncle had read a book about religion. And to get him to confess to his political crimes, they woke up everybody, and including myself, I was the youngest in the home. I was only 4 years old at the time. They pointed a gun to my head and threatening to kill me if my uncle didn't confess to his crimes.
Hello, welcome to Harvard Square and the start of a brand new program season for Cambridge Forum. Thank you all for joining us on this pleasant September evening to discuss a timely topic: Chinese democracy in crisis, the new Long March. As per usual, we're right deep in there examining the recent events in Hong Kong, previously a popular tourist destination, an international trading nexus, and now a political hotspot. Until April of this year, Hong Kong, which is an SAR, which is a special administrative region, and one of only 2 ex-colonies with that status, had operated somewhat autonomously under Chinese control. A 50-year mandate was granted to Hong Kong in 1997 when the British left, and for the last 20 years, residents in the region were typically calm and law-abiding. While all that changed suddenly in April 2019, and chaos erupted on the streets. Ever since, Hong Kong has been the site of increasingly strident demonstrations by pro-democracy supporters, many of whom are students. In June, Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong leader, finally withdrew the controversial bill which had triggered the protests. This bill would have allowed suspected criminals to be extradited to mainland China. Throughout the summer, as Hong Kong activist demonstrations grew in size and strength, the police responded with increasing brutality: tear gas, water cannons, rubber bullets, and finally gangs who viciously attacked supporters. Many protesters have subsequently been arrested. Numbers are unclear, but the students remain resolute. Earlier today on the BBC, Joshua Wong, a leading activist, said that protests will continue. The gesture of withdrawing the proposed extradition legislation comes too little, too late. Protesters now have a list of other demands, including greater political reform, an independent inquiry into the Hong Kong police, and universal suffrage. I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and tonight we're going to discuss the situation in Hong Kong, which provides a litmus test for the Chinese government's response to protesters' demands for democratic reform. The world media watches. In addition, we are going to examine the persecution and detention of 3 million Muslim Uyghurs within mainland China. And finally, we will consider the long-term foreign policy objectives of the Chinese government. Tonight, we're fortunate to have with us 3 human rights activists, each of whom is equipped to address different aspects of Chinese domestic and foreign policy. We're honored to welcome Kyle Olbert, Director of Operations for the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement, Teng Bao, a human rights lawyer and adjunct professor at the City University of New York, and just recently returned from Taiwan. And finally, Ambassador Salih Hudayar, who's a Uyghur American in exile and who escaped severe oppression in China to found a group called Etnam in 2017. Salih will address the history of China's human rights abuses of minority populations. After all these presentations, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. It's my great pleasure to introduce Kyle Olbert.
My name is Kyle Olbert. I am a human rights activist and the Director of Operations for the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement. As Mary mentioned, the topic this evening is China and China's new Long March. The Long March was a series of strategic military retreats undertaken by Communist China's Red Army, a precursor to today's People's Liberation Army, as they attempted to evade Chinese KMT nationalist forces. Today we see a different long march, a strategic retreat by China from the liberal, rules-based international order. Tonight, I will be painting the broader picture and focusing on the challenges that we in the free world face with regard to China in other areas outside of human rights. Let me preface this by stating emphatically that the Chinese people and the Chinese government are different things. The Chinese people are some of the brightest, most industrious, most loving and beautiful people that I have ever met. And so I want to make certain that whenever I speak tonight about China, you all clearly understand that I am leveling these criticisms at the Chinese government and not at the Chinese people. The first threat that I'd like to discuss concerns espionage. As somebody who works on human rights issues related to China, this is actually a bigger concern for me than some of you might expect. Almost every week I hear reports from persecuted people who say that they or their families have been targeted by Chinese intelligence operatives. The population that I work with, which is mainly made up of Uyghurs, an ethnically Turkic people whom China is imprisoning in concentration camps, prisons, and labor camps, which Sully will discuss later, are perhaps the population that is most targeted by Chinese intelligence, outside of China's traditional state adversaries, namely the United States. In the past 3 years, there have been several alarming instances of U.S. government employees betraying their country in order to act as agents of a foreign power, namely China. There was the case of ex-CIA officer Kevin Mallory, who was just sentenced to 20 years for selling classified defense information to the Chinese. Then there's a case of Jerry Chun-Shing Lee, who recently pled guilty to conspiring to deliver national defense information to a foreign government, and he is awaiting sentence last I checked. Then there's the case of Candace Marie Claiborne, a former U.S. State Department employee who pled guilty to conspiring to defraud the United States after lying to law enforcement and background investigators about her extensive contacts with Chinese intelligence and lying about receiving tens of thousands of dollars in gifts after passing on information about the U.S.-China strategic economic dialogue to the Chinese. Lastly, there's the case of Ronald Rockwell Hansen, who is a former Defense Intelligence Agency employee who in March pled guilty to attempting to steal and deliver U.S. national security military secrets to the Chinese government. And guess what? All 4 of those cases have been prosecuted in just the last 3 years. So this is truly a whole of government problem that the United States is facing. But on the topic of Uyghurs, just last week, it was announced that China had infected some 11 Uyghur websites with malware making use of a number of zero-day exploits. Now, for those of you who are not tech savvy, a zero-day exploit is a previously unknown vulnerability in the software that you might use. These are very expensive vulnerabilities to discover, and they are very valuable if sold. So that should give you an idea of how high of a priority the Chinese place on targeting minority populations, dissidents, and the like. It isn't yet clear how many Uyghurs were infected with this malware, but this case is emblematic of a much larger issue: China's usage of next-generation cyber warfare capabilities, in other words, hacking, for collecting intelligence. These are capabilities that China uses to great effect against American companies in order to steal intellectual property. In fact, China's intellectual property theft costs the U.S. economy between $225 billion to $600 billion annually, according to the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property, In July, FBI Director Wray stated that the FBI currently has some 1,000 ongoing investigations into Chinese intellectual property theft. And we aren't talking about minor theft. We aren't talking about pirating movies or stealing music or selling knockoff Louis Vuitton bags. We're talking about serious theft. For instance, in 2014, the Department of Justice charged 9 Chinese nationals with engaging in several hacking attempts, successful hacking attempts, against US companies on behalf of the People's Liberation Army. One of those companies was Westinghouse, the American company which designs nuclear reactors. Alleged in the Department of Justice's 2014 indictment is the hair-raising charge that technical and design specifications were among the materials stolen. In other words, China has literally stolen our nuclear know-how. And that's not all that China's government has stolen. It has stolen American jobs, and this is a point on which both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders will agree, and plenty of people in between them. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the trade deficit that came with China's 2001 ascension to the World Trade Organization has cost the United States some 3.4 million jobs. Of course, all of these things are small potatoes if war breaks out between China and the United States. That's the real risk. And the risk is more real than ever in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a key commercial thoroughfare which connects Asia, Europe, Africa, and the rest of the world. And its seabed is rich in mineral resources like oil and gas. A third of global shipping, or some $3.37 trillion, transits through the South China Sea. The root of the problem in the South China Sea stems from the fact that some 6 countries assert various different, sometimes overlapping territorial claims. The Philippines, Vietnam, China, Brunei, Taiwan, and Malaysia all base these territorial claims on various accounts of history and geography. These differences have been handled mostly well until 2014, when China began a massive dredging operation to build artificial islands there in the South China Sea, which they promptly began militarizing in order to assert control over the 1.3 million square miles of territory that they had claimed there. According to the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which is part of Washington's Center for Strategic and International Studies, satellite images show that the Chinese have built missile shelters and radar and communications facilities on at least 3 of the artificial islands there, in contradiction to the pledge that Chinese President Xi Jinping made in 2015 to President Obama. More recently, the Chinese have even tested a ship killer missile from the man-made structures on those islands. This is a missile that could conceivably sink one of our aircraft carriers. The problem that we face with China is a very, very hard one. But more importantly, it's one that has real human cost. The next 2 speakers can both attest to that. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Mr. Ting Bao, who is a world-renowned human rights expert and a human rights lawyer who escaped from China via Hong Kong and is currently serving as the Grove Scholar for Human Rights at the City University of New York's Hunter College. Ting.
I became a university teacher and a human rights lawyer since 2003. Over time, I learned that there were a few blackheads in the world who felt awful when they saw others being bullied and persecuted. When they felt awful, they were unwilling to keep it to themselves, so they shouted out and wrote it up. They hurled themselves forward, huffing and shouting, determined to fight to the end. In China, among this small group of people are lawyers, scholars, journalists, bloggers, petitioners. I'm belonging to this group. When I was in China, I defended Christians, Falun Gong practitioners, and other persecuted religious groups, political dissidents, Tibetans and Uyghurs, victims of forced abortion and forced demolition, victims of torture and all kinds of injustice. I wrote articles to criticize the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. I organized protests against corruption and unfair trial. I attended meetings commemorating Tiananmen massacre. I helped Dr. Liu Xiaobo to draft Charter 08 and collect signatures. Definitely, the Chinese government does not tolerate any kind of challenges to its monopoly of power. I was disbarred and prevented from traveling internationally. I was banned from teaching and fired by the university. I was put under house arrest from time to time. My wife and my children were also targeted. I was mentally and physically tortured. On the night of February 19, 2011, the secret police covered me in a black hood, handcuffed me, and threw me in a black car, took me to a black jail. I was forced to wear handcuffs 24/7, stay in one position. They put me under an extreme form of solitary confinement for 70 days, adding punches and face slapping. Because of the Charter 08, the manifesto calling for a meaningful democracy in China, Liu Xiaobo was sentenced to 11 years and passed away after being detained for 8 years and 8 months. He is the only Nobel Prize laureate who died in custody. I was a visiting scholar in Hong Kong in 2014, witnessing and participating in the waves of demonstrations demanding the universal suffrage of Hong Kong people. The universal suffrage has been promised by Beijing, and it was articulated in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and Hong Kong Basic Law. But after Hong Kong's handover to China in 1997, the Chinese government broke its promises, its international commitments again and again. In August 2014, Chinese government issued a white paper, actually destroyed the one country, two systems formula. And then it crushed the umbrella movement. And then Chinese secret police kidnapped publishers and booksellers in Hong Kong and Thailand. They also kidnapped a billionaire in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government, Beijing's puppet authority, disqualified pro-democracy Congress members, banned a pro-independent party, and proposed an extradition bill, which will put every Hong Konger's safety in danger. Hong Kong people know well about the mainland China's judicial system. It's like a combination of torture, corruption, forced confession, and show trials. Since June this year, millions of Hong Kong people went out to the street protesting against this extradition bill. But what the authorities responded to the demands was tear gas, rubber bullets, beanbags, mass arrests, mafia attacks, humiliation, and demonization. People are worrying about the possibility of another Tiananmen massacre in Hong Kong. Today marks the 18th anniversary of 9/11 attacks, which deeply influenced the international political landscape. While counter-terrorism became a major political agenda of the West, the atrocities of the CCP were somehow ignored and connived. 18 years ago, there were some other incidents related to the rise of the dictatorial regime. The United States granted China the Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status, which actually delinked trade to China's human rights abuse. Beijing was given the opportunity to host Olympic Games. and China entered the World Trade Organization. CCP became the big winner of the war against terrorism, but China's party-state terrorism is looming. With the low human rights advantage, China has become the second largest economy in the world, but China's economy miracle has not led to political freedom or an open society, but rather has greatly strengthened the CCP's control and suppressive capacity. The rise of China in reality is not the rise of Chinese people, but the rise of the CCP. People living in China do not have access to Google, Facebook, or Twitter, nor do they have the right to protect their houses or land. They do not have religious freedom or the right to vote. Forced disappearance, torture, secret police, corruption, extra-legal detentions, and forced demolitions have all been rampant. Since Xi Jinping came to power, the human rights situation has been hugely deteriorating. He initiated the comprehensive crackdown on human rights lawyers, NGOs, internet scholars, underground churches, Tibetans, and Uyghurs. In East Turkestan, at least 2 million people have been arbitrarily detained in the concentration camps. With its economic rise and technological development, China has accelerated its march towards an advanced version of 1984. I name it as high-tech totalitarianism. The Chinese Communist Party utilizes its lead in artificial intelligence to make its control of Chinese society even more total. China's Great Firewall, social media, big data, e-commerce, and modern telecommunications make it easier for the CCP to keep people under severe surveillance. The internet has been used by the CCP as an effective tool for censorship, propaganda, and brainwashing. Face recognition, voice print recognition, gait recognition, DNA collection, and biometric tags have all systematized the CCP's growing control. The social credit system is a horrible case that may have surpassed the imagination of George Orwell. China's public surveillance camera network will keep growing with some 2.76 billion units slated to be installed by 2022. For every Chinese citizen, there will be 2 surveillance cameras. CCP has built a regime which is an exact opposition to liberal democracy. Even worse, it has become the most urgent and most aggressive threat to global democracy and human rights. South China Sea, Belt and Road Initiative, the manipulation of UN human rights mechanisms, the overseas abductions, so on and so on. It is high time for the democratic countries to stop their engagement policy towards China in the name of appeasement policy. Thank you.
And next, I would like to introduce Saleh Hudayar, who is the ambassador to the United States from the East Turkestan government in exile, as well as the founder of the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement.
Today is the 18th anniversary of the September 11th terror attacks, and I'd like to talk about the current terrorism that is being perpetrated by China's government against the people of East Turkestan. You may have heard, and as Mary mentioned earlier, some 3 million or more Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples are currently being incarcerated in concentration camps under the pretext of counterterrorism. Terrorism is not the real problem, and it's not the real reason why. Firstly, this region, like Tibet, was an independent nation prior to Communist China occupying it in 1949. China has since renamed it to Xinjiang, which means the new territory, and this is the root of the problem. Since China colonized this region, occupied this region, it began a campaign of colonization. First, it purged a lot of intellectuals, businessmen, including my own great-grandfather, who I'm named after. He was killed for being a capitalist by the communist regime. Then throughout over the years, China began to conduct nuclear tests in East Turkestan. From 1964 to 1996, some 46 nuclear tests were conducted in which roughly 800,000 people were killed, and millions were exposed to various cancerous diseases as a result of radiation. Between 1979 to 2009, the Chinese Communist government has stated that it has prevented 3.7 million births in East Turkestan as part of its family planning policy. Following the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of West Turkestan, China launched the Strike Hard campaign in 1996 because it feared East Turkestan independence sentiments. In 1997, tens of thousands of East Turkestanis demonstrated in Gulja. The demonstration was brutally suppressed, with hundreds killed and thousands arrested. During 1997 to 1998, over 100,000 people were arrested for political crimes, including my uncle. And this was my first interaction with the Chinese Communist regime. In the middle of the night, they raided our home because my uncle had read a book about religion. And to get him to confess to his political crimes, they woke up everybody, and including myself, I was the youngest in the home. I was only 4 years old at the time. They pointed a gun to my head and threatening to kill me if my uncle didn't confess to his crimes. So in order to save my life, my uncle confessed to being a part of some non-existent organization and was sentenced to many years in prison. 2 weeks prior to 9/11, China's government claimed that this region, that East Turkestan, was peaceful and there was no unrest. However, right after 9/11, China claimed that it was a victim of terrorism. And shortly after, they launched a brutal campaign to suppress East Turkestani and Uyghur identity, culture, language, and our religious practices. In 2014, China launched the Strike Hard and Securitization campaign, in which they installed millions of CCTV cameras across the region, put up thousands of checkpoints, and began the mass arrests of what would lead to 3 million people as we speak, according to the Department of Defense, being locked up in concentration camps. Officially in 2016, China launched its re-education and transformation campaign. China declared East Turkestanis enemies of the state and the people. Hundreds of prisons, concentration camps, and labor camps were built across the region. Millions of people were arrested solely on their Turkic ethnic identity and their religion. It's fitting that we're discussing this on 9/11 because China is justifying this brutal crimes against humanity in the name of counterterrorism. From 2016 to 2017, according to Chinese state media Xinhua, some 36 million people's DNAs, voice prints, and retina scans were collected across East Turkestan. What's even more disturbing was in 2017, the People's Liberation Army's biowarfare strategy recommended that China develop genetic ethnic-specific attacks against China's enemies. In July of this year, the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement, after conducting a project for several months, we found 193 prisons, 124 concentration camps, and 66 labor camps using satellite imagery. And we estimated that there's at least 3.6 million people being detained. Inside the camps, China is putting people into forced indoctrination, political indoctrination, where they're forced to renounce their ethnic religious identity. They're undergoing forced medication, sterilization, forced starvation, rape, and even organ harvesting. Outside of the camps, some 500,000 children have been separated from their families and sent to state-run orphanages and boarding schools where they are raised as loyal Chinese citizens. China is shutting down and bulldozing religious sites, mosques and churches, and even graveyards are not being spared. Reports from Radio Free Asia stated that China is building crematoria across the region. China is offering huge incentives, including free housing and sign-up bonus in cash, and even a Turkic wife to Han Chinese settlers who settle in what it calls its new territory. Forced marriages of Uyghur and Turkic women to Han Chinese men are part of China's state policy. What is happening is a genocide, and it hasn't yet been recognized as a genocide by the international community. But in the UN Genocide Conventions, everything that I mentioned here follows under their definition of genocide. The real reason here is not terrorism, as China claims it to be, but rather an effort to eradicate the separate ethnic and national identity held by the people of East Turkestan. In July 2019, China announced a white paper and a national defense strategy. In the white paper, they claimed that East Turkestan never existed and that the Uyghurs were actually Chinese and not Turkic. China's national defense strategy claimed that listed one of its top national defense goals is to prevent the creation of East Turkestan. Thus, why I founded Ethnum was to raise awareness about this situation, because existing organizations only focused on the human rights aspect and didn't focus on the political aspect. And we believe that if we do not have our political rights, there's no way that we can guarantee and safeguard our human rights or our other freedoms. Thus, the main point that I want to leave here with is that the United States government and the international community need to uphold the UN Genocide Convention and recognize what China is doing as a genocide, and to act immediately through sanctions, through diplomatic démarches, and other means to prevent a 21st century Holocaust. Thank you.
I think that was quite a staggering amount of appalling information, which I have to say seems to be withheld from the Western media. Until I saw a BBC report about 6 weeks ago about the actual camps themselves, which one reporter managed to get into, and it was remarkable, the song and dance routine they put on for them. People dancing around, frolicking, enjoying themselves. They said, well, where are the recreational places? Are people allowed outside? Oh, yes, 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 they have wonderful games, and they do basketball. And so within 24 hours, their satellite pictures of these camps had changed, and these miraculous athletic facilities appeared within about 24 hours. This is the speed and the scale of this genocide operation. What I can't believe is how this has been kept. With all our technology and satellite coverage, how is it that this has been kept from the Western human rights organizations? Nobody seems to be doing anything about it.
Well, one of the reasons is that, Western governments are, or largely most governments across the world, are heavily intertwined with China economically. So they don't want to upset China in fear of, having an economic backlash or disrupting economic relations with China. So they are remaining silent on this issue. As far as why human rights organizations are not able to go into the region is another story, because of this severe securitization program that China has. Every 500 meters there's checkpoints, and the journalists that have been able to go there, many of them have been harassed, many of their footages have been deleted, and many have been even deported.
It was interesting that you raised the Tiananmen Square point. Two reasons. One is, I remember meeting a child recently, a teenager, who had been in China because his parents were there for 3 years. And he said that there was no mention on the internet anywhere of anything having occurred in Tiananmen Square. When you did a search in China, it didn't happen. So that's one thing, is that history is being rewritten in the same way that you said this is happening in other areas, that East Turkestan was never anything but Chinese. This is becoming a fact, which is way past Orwell's fantasies. And then the other thing is, I was always appalled that America, at the very same time this was going on, was making China most favored nation. So do you think the American government have some responsibility for this appeasement and ignoring of what was actually going on to further purely economic gain?
You know, it's very interesting to me that you mentioned the issue of censorship of Tiananmen Square, because that's not simply the case in China. You now find that Western tech companies are censoring things along the Chinese Communist Party line as well. For instance, with Tiananmen Square, I would challenge all of the viewers, all of the audience members to go to their Google web browser. I did this maybe a week and a half ago. Go to your Google, go to the Google search engine and type in Tiananmen Square. Then go to Google Translate, type in Tiananmen Square, get the Chinese translation back, go back to Google, copy and paste the Chinese translation of Tiananmen Square into Google, okay? And what you're going to see in the English results and in the Chinese results are two completely different things. In the English results, you'll see pictures of Tank Man. In the Chinese results, you won't. And this is the level of authoritarian influence that is being exerted over the Western free world through this entanglement that Sully talked about. You know, this economic entanglement and interdependency that we have with China. And so to your second question about most favored nation status, I do think this was probably the worst mistake that America has made in the past several decades with regard to China, because we did not condition that most favored nation trading status, now it's called PNTR, Permanent Normalized Trade Relations, on China's adherence to basic fundamental human rights policies. And we see the effects of this today. We see it in Hong Kong, we see it in East Turkestan, we see it throughout China. I mean, China is literally becoming a prison for 1.34 billion people.
17 days after the Tiananmen massacre, the then President George H.W. Bush wrote a letter to Chinese dictator butcher Deng Xiaoping. And a few months later, President Bush, Senior Bush, sent his representative, Scott Roft, to Beijing to meet Deng Xiaoping to show goodwill. And then in 1949, the most favored nation was granted. And then China was allowed to enter the WTO. And the Western companies, they prioritized money. They don't care about human rights. Maybe many of you know the case of Yahoo, that Yahoo provided its clients' information to Chinese state security, and that led at least 4 Chinese writers and dissidents into prison, and long-term prison, 10 years and 5 years. So both Democratic Party and Republican Party, and both the Western governments and the companies, the global, the tech giants, they should be responsible for the current situation, the rise of China's, I call it high technology totalitarianism.
So I have a couple of questions for you, Sully. 2 things that are rather odd to me when you were talking. One is your grandfather was arrested because he was a capitalist.
Well, he was executed right after the Chinese communists invaded East Turkestan. And so what the Chinese communists did was they seized the wealth of all these Turkestanis and executed wealthy capitalists because, you know, they're communists.
But many of the successful communists are now billionaires. I can't wrap my head around this.
Well, part of this is, you know, they're doing the same thing right now. They've seized all of our wealth. All of our wealthy people are in prison or in concentration camps, and it's part of China's policy to, you know, keep our people in poverty to where we are only worried about feeding ourselves, to where we can't think about anything beyond that.
Survival. Okay, the last question for you is, why are the Chinese harvesting all this DNA? What is the end game for this whole thing?
So initially, we thought, it was part of their organ harvesting campaign policy. We thought that maybe they're going to try to find whose organs might, match their customers. But after reading the People's Liberation Army's biowarfare strategy, we fear that they may be developing, ethnic-specific genetic attacks as recommended in the biowarfare strategy.
Now, of course, the Chinese justification for the collection of all this DNA is for law enforcement purposes. And, let's hope it's something so benign. But the scale that they're doing this, the speed at which they're doing this, really lends credence to the theory that there's something more to it. And in fact, China Mill, China's military website, kind of their public-facing military PR website, featured the opening of the China National Gene Bank, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, which makes you wonder, why would the Chinese military website be carrying that kind of news, right?
It's too frightening. Last question before I open up. Teng, why should we be concerned in terms of looking at Hong Kong as a kind of microcosm of the big picture? Why is this such a test case? And is there any chance at all that the Chinese will let the Hong Kong region be in any way different from mainland China? Why do we think that they will maybe do that? Why would they?
Yeah, Hong Kong is a perfect case that the so-called one country, two system is not possible. Hong Kong used to be a free financial center. It has no democracy. It had no democracy under the rule of United Kingdom, but it really had rule of law, civil society, and freedom. And then it was taken over by the Chinese government, and then gradually its rule of law, its freedom, its human rights were taken away. The universal suffrage, the meaningful democracy that are promised by the Chinese government were not realized, and Beijing will definitely refuse the democracy of Hong Kong people. And now Hong Kong's protests are increasing, and Hong Kong people have 5 demands, and one of the demands is withdrawal of the extradition bill has been agreed by the Hong Kong government, but there are still 4 demands. And the last demand is universal suffrage. And I think Chinese Communist Party will never agree a universal suffrage. And Hong Kong and Beijing will continue to oppress Hong Kong pro-democracy protests, and so I'm afraid there will be more and more violence against the protesters. There are more and more mafia attacks, and some. There have been more and more evidence that some Chinese policemen, maybe soldiers, are
undercover.
In the demonstration, and then they use excessive violence. So that's really
provocateur.
Well, I would love to open questions up to people.
I had never heard of Turkestan, and I'm pretty aware of what's going on. And you said it was because the US government, the Western people, were concerned about their finances. But we have heard about the riots in Hong Kong. We have heard about Tiananmen Square. So why is Turkestan different than that? It doesn't, I mean, you know, if everyone was so concerned about finances, we would never have heard, and that was the reason. And my question to you is, do the Hong Kong people have any, you mentioned the Hong Kong police, you know, like beating people up and stuff. That would suggest that the Hong Kong police are not chosen by the Hong Kong people or the Hong Kong government, but by mainland China. Do the Hong Kong people have any right to vote, to pick their own leaders and therefore their own police? And if not, have you guys ever thought of declaring yourself an independent nation such as Taiwan?
It was more independent under England than it ever was today.
Okay, as far as your question, the reason, you know, actually, if you look at historical maps produced by, you know, the U.S. Treasury Department from 1899, it actually labels it as East Turkestan. East Turkestan was an independent republic prior to Communist China invading it and taking it over and dismantling it. Like Tibet, we got occupied, and China renamed East Turkestan to Xinjiang, which means the new territory. So on the map, it's currently known as Xinjiang. That's probably the main reason why you don't hear about it, is because the international community in the media or even in governments, they don't use the term East Turkestan.
We haven't heard about the riot, whatever the region is, we haven't heard about the riots and the abuse. I mean, we've heard about what's going on in Hong Kong, it's in the news. You know, we heard about Tiananmen Square. We haven't heard about your area at all.
Well, it has been making it on the news, but it's not as much as it should be. And there's numerous reasons for this, because, you know, if it's all over the media, then the people are going to pressure the governments. Why are we not doing anything to free those 3 million people in those concentration camps? And especially when the government right now, especially the United States, is trying to negotiate a trade deal with China, they don't want this issue to be highlighted to where it might undermine such negotiations.
Well, yeah, so no, the Hong Kong police force is, you know, chosen by the Hong Kong government, but the Hong Kong government is loyal to Beijing. And in fact, the Hong Kong chief executive is elected from a slate of candidates whom Beijing selects. So basically, they stack the deck so that whoever is chosen will be pro-Beijing. So the people in Hong Kong, in a way, kind of are living under a state of foreign mainland occupation. They don't have a say in their government, and you know, I believe they should. And why are they not advocating for independence? Well, I think they're probably the assessment that they make is that their 5 demands are more achievable than outright independence.
First, Hong Kong's chief executive was elected by a committee of 1,200 people, and the current chief executive got 789 votes. And that's what Hong Kong people are demanding for the 1 person, 1 vote. And many Hong Kong police have been trained in Xinjiang, in the East Turkestan, and other part of China. So they have been influenced by Chinese Communist Party very much.
So first, thank you for your courage to speak up and try to raise awareness to these important issues. I think it's really important, and it's admirable. So thank you. My question, so I've been very concerned about China and the rise of China for quite a while. One of my colleagues is from Africa, and the Chinese are all over Africa as well, investing and sort of taking over those economies there as well. So, and supporting non-democratic types of governments. And so I think there's a lot of negative activity in the world that can be traced back to China, which can be traced back to us and our economic plans, I guess, we had with China for them to manufacture inexpensively for us to buy things cheap. So it's all intertwined, and I'm wondering if you have a recipe for how we can change. What can we do on two levels? What is a way to change and to disempower China? And secondly, what, as citizens here in the United States, should we be trying to do?
So on the topic of Africa, I truly love Africa, and I think what you should do when you go home is go ahead and go to your favorite search engine and type in China African Union headquarters hacking. When the African Union was building their headquarters, I think it was maybe 6-7 years ago, they sought help and financing from the Chinese government. And it was later discovered that the contractors who built that had bugged the entire African Union headquarters. And this, I think, is really emblematic of China's treatment of Africa as kind of a neo-colonialist place for them to extract the raw materials that they need, specifically the rare earth minerals that they need for all of the electronics that we buy from them. So as citizens, what can we do, right? That's the question we should be asking. Of course, don't buy things that are made in China if you can help it. Don't. There are other countries that are way less worse on human rights. There's Vietnam, there's India, there's Indonesia, and they all have their problems. We all do, right? But none of them have 3 million people in concentration camps. Secondly, press your legislators, right? Why are we having hearings on crazy nonsense when we should be focused on the real, clear and present danger to not only to 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people, but really to us, to our freedoms here at home. So talk to your legislator, talk to your councilman, your mayor, your governor, and get them to put pressure on your representatives, your senators.
It's such a big topic. Pressure them about what?
Well, first off,
what should we be asking?
We need to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. We also need to pass the Protect Hong Kong Act. Both of these things will go a long ways towards helping us to shore up the protesters in Hong Kong with our support by stopping the sale of things like tear gas and munitions to the Hong Kong police, and by creating a mechanism for a yearly review of Hong Kong's current autonomous status. In other words, an assessment that will be done by the US government on whether Hong Kong still retains any level of autonomy. Also, we should pass the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. This is important legislation that will address the atrocities that China is committing against the Uyghurs. I'm sure Tang would have other suggestions as well.
The more you know about China, the human rights issues in China, the more you will know how to do. For example, the Confucius Institute. There are more than 1,000 Confucius Institute in the world. Or no, a few, 500-600 Confucius Institute and more than 1,000 Confucius classrooms. And it's not an institute of Chinese language or Chinese culture learning. It's kind of propaganda, and it has own political agenda, and it has been a threat to the academic freedom in the United States and other countries. So you can write letters to stop the Confucius Institute when your state has this kind of institution.
and like Cisco, the Great Firewall, facilitated China's internet censorship, and Cisco played a very important role in helping Chinese government to set up the GFW. And most importantly, the government, especially the United States government, should link the human rights in China to something that Beijing cares. So that's very effective and important way. Beijing cares about Olympic Games. Beijing cares about its face, cares about hosting G20, hosting APEC. So we should boycott Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. Winter Olympics.
2022.
Yeah, and we should boycott all these kind of international conference that Beijing is hosting. So the United States government knows what Beijing cares, and for example, the current trade war between China and the United States. So human rights should be an important agenda.
And if I could jump back in and add one more thing, I would urge you to talk to your financial advisors and to see if you are holding in your portfolios and your retirement funds any Chinese stocks, because divestment from Chinese companies is a very powerful tool that could be brought to bear. When Americans start dumping those Chinese stocks, when pension funds, right, when institutional investors who have invested billions and billions of dollars in Chinese stocks start dumping them because of human rights concerns, well, maybe China will start to change.
Lastly, I'd like to add that, as I mentioned earlier, getting the United States government to recognize what is going on as a genocide. In addition to that, if the United States government would recognize East Turkestan as an occupied territory like they recognize Tibet.
I don't know if you observe this difference between the Tiananmen Square massacre and the Hong Kong situation. 30 years ago, when Tiananmen Square massacre happened, all the graduate students or undergraduates in the United States will support the students, the protesters. And they were granted a green card afterwards by the U.S. government. But the Hong Kong situation is a lot of young students from China support Chinese government instead of Hong Kong protesters, because they have been brainwashed for 30 years. They didn't even know what is the truth, what's going on. Even they came to the West, they think they are the second strongest economy. They are very, very proud of their country. They're proud of China instead of against their government. So what do you think about the young generation in China and how, I just observed this difference. I don't know if you have or not.
Yeah, I think your observation is correct. In 1989, not only in Beijing, most cities in China had protesters, demonstrations, and demanding for democracy and freedom. And overseas students, most of them supported the pro-democracy protesters. Now we have seen that thousands of Chinese students they harassed and attacked the pro-Hong Kong activists, and they labeled Hong Kong protesters as separatists or terrorists. Violence. That's one thing is the brainwashing, the propaganda for the past 3 decades are so effective. So many Chinese students, the younger generation, not only younger generation, the several generations have been brainwashed. In China, there are a few Chinese, many of my friends, but very few Chinese people. They want to show their support for Hong Kong, and they wrote articles. They even had some performance art to support Hong Kong, and then they were arrested and disappeared, and some of them have been sentenced. So and one thing is it's also related to why many Western people don't know about East Turkestan's concentration camps, because Chinese government is so skilled at manipulating media, and they buy the foreign media. There was a report by Hoover Institute last year that most Chinese language media have been controlled by Chinese government here. And many English newspapers and media have been influenced by Chinese government. Like even New York Times, Washington Post, they published some Communist Party propaganda stuff. So it's hard. It's really disappointing that the power of the Chinese Communist Party is so influential in the whole world now.
Do I have time to take a swing at this one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. One issue that we haven't discussed yet, and which you did touch on when you mentioned Chinese overseas students, is this difference between Tiananmen Square and today. Whereas in Tiananmen Square, many Chinese overseas students were supportive of the Tiananmen protesters, and today you see many Chinese overseas students almost up in arms about the Hong Kong protesters. And
Objecting to it.
Objecting, to their 5 demands, and being vociferous in their support for Beijing and for the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that one interesting thing to look at is the proliferation of Chinese students and scholars associations, in addition to the Confucius Institutes. These CSSAs have really metastasized since the days of Tiananmen, and it is alleged, actually by no less than the FBI, that the CSSAs liaise with the nearest Chinese consulates or embassies in their area. In other words, this is a way by which the Chinese government can extend its arm onto American soil and organize Chinese national students who, frankly, are afraid of stepping one toe out of line, even here on our campuses, because the government back home will find out.
Can I just raise a point on that issue? It's clear that there's a lot more fear-based. You've got this highly surveyed population. What did you say? There's going to be 2 cameras for every single person, which is just mind-boggling. I mean, so that's frightening. But then there's, how did you have the guts and the courage to stand up with no thought to what was the consequence for you and your family? I mean, how did that play out? You never did say how you got out.
Okay. Yeah. So since 1949, China is always a one-party rule, and but after after 1990s, there was kind of space for the so-called civil society to develop the kind of civil human rights movement, and so I am one of the earliest promoters of the human rights movement since early 2000. And then more and more lawyers and activists joined the human rights movement. So we supported each other, and we could have some victories. We won a few political or human rights cases. So the background is Chinese Communist Party had to shift its ideology from kind of class struggle to rule of law or human rights. The human rights protection was even added to Chinese constitution. So we use that kind of discursive space and social space and develop our movement. And for me, I'm a scholar, I'm a lawyer, so I always think it's my duty to speak out. If I don't do so, if I know this injustice, this abuse of power, this corruption, and I keep silent, I'll be very, very painful. So every time I was detained, I had to make a little bit compromise to continue my human rights work. And after I was released, I went even further. And then how I went out. So in 2014. Many activists, including the activists involving New Citizens Movement, were all arrested. And I was in Hong Kong. I'm one of the initiators of the New Citizens Movement. And if I went back from Hong Kong to mainland China, I would be definitely arrested and sentenced at least 10 years. So I went from Hong Kong to Boston. So 5 years ago, I landed in Boston,
And were you a political refugee? Were you given asylum?
Of course, I'm qualified to apply for political asylum, but I didn't for various reasons.
So you had a Hong Kong passport?
No, I have Chinese passport. But eventually I applied for EB-1A, that's kind of alien of extraordinary ability, and then I got my green card.
Actually, I came from China, mainland China, but I'm also working in Hong Kong more than 10 years. So I know something about it. You are talking about the issue. I really hope something changed in China in the future. But I used to hear another argument. During the last 30 years, China, it's a very huge development. So they can feed 1.4 billion people. That means China, we have the single party. We have a very strong government. This should be a good thing. So I totally agree with you. Since the beginning, you said we don't want against the Chinese people. We just don't like the China government. It's a good thing, I think. But the thing is that, do you really think the trade war, it should be works? Do you really think we just call all the world people don't buy the good from the China? It should be against the China government. It can change the China government. On the other hand, it's that you just call all the people don't buy the China stock, even the sale of the portfolio of their shares. It really works.
Well, what would you suggest?
Yeah, that's why my suggestion is what we are talking about here, it's everybody wants a world. It should be a better world. So do you guys have any real suggestion? What we are going to do to help the Chinese, help the 1.4 billion people there?
If I understand correctly, what you're saying is that the Chinese people need a strong party, a strong one-party state in order to maintain the kind of power and control necessary to provide for 1.4 billion people. Is that correct?
Sorry, the thing is that, during the last 30 years development, if you have the chance to compare the last 30 years, there's a very big change in mainland China. So now there are a lot of people can living better than 30 years ago. So in another word, it's, came from the one-party policy. It came from the very strong government.
Okay, well, I guess I would argue that it came from stealing $225 to $600 billion of IP from the United States over the past 3 decades.
Yeah, I used to heard another argument. It's it could be, yes, still some IP, but since the beginning of the United States development, United States government also steal some IP from any other part of the world.
Maybe I can give a brief comment.
I'm afraid we can only do one question.
So I wrote an article titled "The Shadow of the China Miracle." So you were talking about the China economic miracle. So we should look into what behind the China miracle. The human rights and freedom is limited, and the corruption is rampant, and the environment has been destroyed, and the gap between the rich and the poor is bigger and bigger. China is not only the least free country, but also the least equal country. So of course, China has become the second largest economy, and many Chinese people become richer than 30 years ago. But there are so many poor people in China. Most of the benefits of the economic growth are occupied by the privileged family, the party, and government officials. And so the China miracle is not from the one-party rule. If there is not this brutal one-party rule, the economic growth may be much more powerful than the past 30 years. And another thing is human rights and freedom is more important than economic growth. You can ask Uyghur people, Tibetan people. They care about their spirit, their spiritual leader Dalai Lama, their own religion and culture and language, not money.
There's one troubling thing that is very apparent to those of us looking at the Hong Kong situation now. That's a little puzzling, and I wondered if you could help explain. Some of the Hong Kong demonstrators have made a direct appeal to the President of the United States, Donald Trump. This sounds odd to those of us interested in human rights and civic society. I wonder if there's been an equal appeal to other sources of non-governmental organizations or other political strains within the West. The notion that people in Hong Kong feel liberation is coming by way of President Trump sounds laughable to many Americans.
As an Uyghur, we look up to the United States as a beacon of hope and freedom. The United States is the most powerful country in the world. So it's very natural for us to ask for help from the United States versus any other country, especially given that the United States is engaging in, tense relations with China. So we feel that if we ask, and this is what I assume that people of Hong Kong feel too, that if we ask support from the United States, they'll be more willing to give it than if we ask for support from, let's say, Germany or Switzerland or any other country.
I really understand the irony of the fact that the people of Hong Kong are appealing to President Trump because President Trump has actually failed to impose Magnitsky Act sanctions against China's human rights violators and has really not done as much as he could, I think because he's chasing this unicorn of a trade deal, and one that I don't think is going to materialize. That being said, I was looking at footage of the demonstration the other day, and I saw giant pictures of Nancy Pelosi as well. And I think that President Trump is a symbol of America. I don't think it's so much that they agree with President Trump or they think that President Trump actually even cares. I think that he is the personification at the moment of America. And they're looking to us, not just to the American government, but to the American people to care about what's happening there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to thank our wonderful speakers this evening for making long, arduous trips here to be present tonight. Thank you very much, Teng, Kyle, and Sully. Really was an education to hear everything you had to say.